Hello, everyone. We'll take a minute to let more folks trickle in. But as you come in and get settled, I do want to pose a question that folks can answer in the chat. So feel free to drop your name, your pronouns, where you're based, and what's keeping you up at night. So we're going to dig into some hard questions about this moment, but really would love to hear from y'all. So feel free to, again, pop your name, pronouns, where you're based, and what's keeping you up at night. And we'll get started in a minute or two. Thanks everyone for coming in. And thanks for sharing your where you're from, where you're based, and also what's keeping you up at night. Really excited to have this conversation. Um, so we're here for fighting for justice, multiracial democracy, and an equitable economy in dark times. Last year, as a sector, I think we dug into backlash, right? This sort of the mounting oppression, opposition to our work. I think we're past that, right? And we're in the thick of policies, of stories, of actions that are simply undoing progress and eroding society as a whole. So it's in this context that we wanted to have this open conversation and start digging into what this means and what we can do about it. But with that said, we'll kick things off with introductions and then we'll jump into questions. So first, I'm Allison Jones. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the VP of Brand and Storytelling at Common Future. And I will kick it over to you, Jennifer.
Hi, everyone. So good to see you and be in this conversation with you. I'm Jennifer Juguna. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am co-CEO of Common Future.
Angela Glover Blackwell. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the founder in residence at PolicyLink and the Chief Vision Officer for the Democracy Policy Initiative at UC Berkeley Goldman School of Public Policy. Happy to be here. Carla?
And my name is Carla Monteroso. My pronouns are she, her, ella. And I am the managing partner of Brava Leaders, which is the consultancy dedicated to creating the frameworks, policies, systems, social and economic contracts we need for multiracial, multicultural institutions.
Right. Thanks, y'all, for the introductions. Okay, so what I want to do is start with questions for each of you individually so that you can give your perspectives on the moment we're in and what's at stake before digging into some broader questions and themes. So I'll start with you, Jennifer. You've led several conversations about what's happening in courtrooms across the country, from the Fearless Fund lawsuits to the rollback of affirmative action and what they mean for social justice organizations. Zooming out a little bit, what does the legal landscape look like right now? Specifically, what patterns are you seeing in how law is being used to erode justice? And what is the larger significance for the work at the intersection of race, class, and democracy?
Yeah, thank you for kicking us off with that question. I think for me, what I'll say is I think it's really important, for all of us to have an understanding of the law. And I know sometimes there's a lot of legal jargon. It feels out of reach. It feels like something's happening in some courtroom far away. There's a lot of paperwork, but it's really critical that we all have an understanding. And so I'm excited to just kick us off in that conversation and contribute to that understanding. So to answer the question about the legal landscape, I actually want to take a moment to paint a picture. So last year, Common Future had the pleasure of visiting the Equal Justice Initiative Legacy Memorial and Museum in Montgomery, Alabama. And when we went to that museum, which really provides just a detailed and rich history of race relations in this country, one of the most striking things that I saw there was a timeline of Supreme Court cases going all the way back to the Dred Scott case from 1857, which, as you know, denied citizenship and government protection to Black people and was decided when slavery was legal. And that timeline brought us to the present day. And I was so struck by just how seeing those cases lined up, well over a period of 100 years, and how clear it was that the law went hand in hand with other tools used, right, to maintain systems. So whether those tools were other legislation, narrative, symbolism, in many instances, violence, and even the rhetoric of everyday people. And it was also clear that the law, in many instances, had been used as a tool of injustice. But at the same time, there were instances where it had been used as a tool for justice, and it often followed and lagged behind some of those other tools that I mentioned. So to bring us to today, we are seeing that play out. We are seeing the push and the pull of whether the law will land on the side of justice or injustice. So I think many of us know after the Supreme Court affirmative action decision that came down in 2023, followed a lot of progress and moves towards justice. And after that lawsuit, there was a litany of other lawsuits targeting organizations and businesses for their diversity, equity, and inclusion practices, even though outside of the higher education context, the law itself actually hadn't changed. But we also saw, and maybe even more quietly, states were already starting to pass legislation and take other action, moving us into the direction of the agenda we see today, even though, like I mentioned, the law didn't necessarily dictate that. Now, since the inauguration, we've seen the many executive orders and directives and the rhetoric that seek to annihilate the progress we've made. So that includes DEI, that includes protections and just recognizing the humanity of immigrants, of trans people, so many others, and that really seeks to destroy government as we know it. But again, what I want to say is that the law hasn't changed. The 14th Amendment hasn't changed. So we're seeing and experiencing in real time the way in which a variety of tools, law being one of them, are working to paint a picture that is bleak and make implications about the law that are not yet fact or not actually fact. And it puts us on defense. And in some instances, it might even make us feel as though we don't have any other tools. But the reality is that the law is still a tool. And it's actually right now serving as one of the guardrails we have in place. And I'll just give you some context about what I mean by that. Since inauguration, less than a full month, 58 lawsuits have been filed by unions, civil liberties organizations, states, attorneys generals, religious organizations, and just groups of individuals that are directly impacted by what these executive orders and directives do. Many of the lawsuits, there's yet to be any decision, but in 19 of them, there have been orders that are either a temporary restraining order, preliminary injunction, or other orders to stop the actions and impacts of the EOs. So I think this is something really worth highlighting because, you know, on a daily basis, the volume of these cases is not lifted up. We might hear about one or the other. And certainly the guardrails that are coming from these decisions, and yes, they're at the beginning of a longer journey for sure. But they also tell us something about the law. They tell us something about the tools that we have. And so the law is still very much a tool when it comes to protecting democracy. But what I want to underscore here is that it can't be the only tool, you know, especially when we're seeing the continued power grabs from the executive branch of government. And so as much as it still is a tool, we also have to just as effectively use the full suite of tools that we have available. So narrative, counter-narrative, education, information sharing, organizing, civic engagement, and many others to help shape the law, as we've seen those tools used to do over the course, you know, of our history and, you know, going back to the time of Dred Scott, and to also help shape how we understand and interact with the law.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, and especially the clarification of law as one of many tools and not the only tool that can be used or should be used. So I really appreciate that. Angela, I want to go over to you. Not too long ago, you wrote in SSIR, How We Achieve a Multiracial Democracy, saying that we need a new story of America that reckons with its racial past. So what story is being written now? What does this story signal to us? And how does it affect how we work?
Well, thank you for that question, Jennifer. Thank you for reminding us about how important the law is and that we can't sit back and hope that the law is going to save us. We have to do everything you said, plus protests. It is really up to us to make our voices heard. It is so interesting about what story are we in now. I must say, this is a cliffhanger and I am on the edge of my seat. This is extraordinary what is going on now. And when I wrote that article, it seems like it's been a couple of years now, it was at a time when we were really beginning to understand the relationship of understanding our history to thinking of when we think about our future. That the only democracy that will, if we have democracy, it'll be because we have a thriving multiracial democracy. We are a multiracial nation. And in order to thrive, we need to be able to give this glorious experiment of democracy a real chance. And we have never done that, which is why it's so important to go back and study the history. Because if we look at the history, we will see why the democracy has been so deeply flawed and is now so fragile. It's because we developed the country based on high ideals and outlandish practices, high ideals of a nation that could be governed of the people, by the people, and for the people, while the people who were in this land were being exposed to genocide and land theft on a scale not to be believed. We were talking about governing of the people, by the people, and for the people, and a huge swath of the people who were Black were in human bondage for the purpose of slave labor. And so to try to do these two things at the same time required gymnastics, moral gymnastics, that are really hurting us so much now. So we've never given democracy a chance. What I was trying to say in that article is that democracy is a good idea. Let's do it. And let's do it by really tapping all of the people, by really having full participation, by understanding that we can dismantle this thing that stands in our way, and that we can actually have governing for human flourishing. And so in the article, I talked about the history, I talked about the things that I just mentioned in passing in depth, but also made this point that the Black-white paradigm, that dehumanizing relationship between Black and white people during the time of slavery, actually set up the protocols of oppression for the country, which is not to diminish anyone's suffering, but it is to lift up that out of that inhuman institution of slavery, the protocols of oppression were set, the protocols that relied on a hierarchy of human value, a protocol that actually talked about that experience that promoted demeaning of human beings, a protocol that felt that some people were in service of others, Black people, a notion of segregation and not providing the resources that anybody should be able to have. Those same protocols apply to what's happening to immigrants now. They've applied to women in terms of how much they have been paid in the workforce. They've applied to Asians in the way that they have been ridiculed in some instances, held up in others to pit people against each other. That pitting against each other for white people and people who were enslaved has been so key. So understanding all of this as a way to be able to let it go. You can't move past it. My friend Manuel Pastor talks about you got to move through it. Can't just jump over it. You got to move through it. And in moving through it, you begin to see that when we actually open up and invest in those who have been systematically left behind, isolated, marginalized, we unleash the assets of the nation. That if this notion of a zero-sum game that supporting one group hurts another is just not true. And that is so borne out today. The way that we have undervalued the labor of poor people and people of color, the way that we have developed our communities in ways that we isolate people from transportation and isolate people who are providing childcare from the people who are paying for childcare. It's hurting us all. And 100 million people in this country, little more, live in poverty or very near poverty. 100 million, that's a third of the country. And that's because of our wages. That's because of the price of housing, which comes out of segregation and communities that we throw away. You penalize, disinvest in one group, everybody suffers. So out of that 100 million, 42% of people who are elderly live in or near poverty. Over half of all children under 18 live in or near poverty. 59% of all Black people, 64% of Latino people, 45% of women, 42% of men living at or near poverty, 41% of Asians, over 60 million white people. This shows us that the curb cut effect is real, that when we invest in people so that they can thrive, we all thrive. When we underinvest in people who have rendered ourselves most vulnerable, society becomes vulnerable. And so I actually believe that this notion of how we achieve a multiracial democracy can really be stated, how do we achieve democracy? How do we achieve democracy for all of the people who live here? Understanding the past, seeing that the continuing underinvestment is hurting us all, and understanding that when we invest in those who have been rendered most marginalized, most vulnerable in society, society benefits enormously.
Whew. Thank you for all of that, especially the zero-sum thinking, right? The idea if you get, I don't. If you have, I'm a have not, and how corrosive and erosive that is to democracy. I really appreciate that framing. Carla, over to you. In your work, you often talk about multiracial, multicultural institutions, a new kind of organization that emerged under Barack Obama. Can you define what these are and what unique challenges you see them and their leaders facing right now?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to back us up just a little bit. I love everything that you just said, Angela. And just add that before all of the destruction that we've seen in the last 2 months, we were already living in an apartheid economy, right? Like you see the Department of Labor statistics, and people of color, Black, Indigenous, and or Latina people in particular, start to drop out of the workforce at the $60,000 mark. And that's not us dropping out, that is us being pushed out, right? So we were high and mid-wage work in America was already segregated, right? Like we never had a parallel movement to integrate high wage and mid-wage work equal to the kinds of integration that happened in other places like education, right? And that meant we were stuck in a stratified economy. And in the last, I would say, like couple of decades, part of what has happened is progressive institutions have really started to take up the call for a multiracial democracy, and you are watching America's first truly multiracial teams, right? Like even our affinity organizations, like I know for like places like MalDef, and while you had a woman maybe here and there, it was primarily men of color and a segregated institution in a different way, right? And so now that we have multiracial, multicultural institutions, which I have been defining as at least 20% people of color at every layer and level of leadership, and at least 40% women and femmes at every layer and level of leadership, we are finding that those institutions have a lot of internal turmoil, in part because we never did the work to create the social and economic contracts that were necessary, the norms and behaviors that were necessary inside of an integrated institution, right? And so we've got a lot of leaders trying to build movements, trying to build businesses with those same principles that segregated institutions were built with, which, as Angela points out, were full of coercion, right? Like full of deals in which economic and social or emotional like coercion was used as a part of labor practices, right? And we are trying to figure out what it looks like to create that new logic, right? And so that was the moment we were in before all of this. And now we're here. And what I would say is the most difficult part for leaders, like I think there are two twin poles for a leader, right? One is got a lot of philanthropy at this point in time, and a lot of investment capital, is in the hands of people who are truly afraid to go outside of what Dr. King called the white moderate, right? Like what he said, and the desire to be risk-free as we are just. And I just like philanthropy often will stop at a cultural consensus that exists within like their social circles, which of course are not tied to the experience of all of America. And so all of these institutions that are now going to be making up what is critical infrastructure for the country, as critical infrastructure is being pulled down from the federal government, are going to be doing it in an underfunded way. And I heard one activist tell me, it's like, it feels like we are passing around the same $20 around to each other, right? And so we're going to have to get very creative and very intentional about our use of money and our push on those people that hold resources in order to get this work done. And I think that that's one pull. And then the second pull is that we have to keep in mind that the country, that the logic of that goes all the way back to slavery has convinced the country the only spaces that are safe are segregated spaces, right? And that means we are going to have to create a relational fabric across difference in order to be able to defeat that logic, right? And a huge logic that rests in anti-Blackness, which is that the most marginalized person in the room is the acceptable trade-off. And we have to grapple with no one being the acceptable trade-off, right? About creating a fabric that creates a true floor of safety for each other. But as we negotiate that, I think a lot of us working inside of these spaces, trying to do this work, like what I have seen in moments of major duress, is that we often will turn on the person with the most amount of power around us. And then that prohibits us from really strategizing about the big powers that we need to defeat. And I want to say that I hold that alongside the major changes that need to happen in our labor infrastructure and what that means leaders need to be and risk right now. I heard another activist talk about our movements being happy being the gods of small things. And we cannot afford to be the gods of small things right now. We are under attack, right? And so we have to figure out ways to be in coalition and how to align with each other, even when we don't agree. Because we live saying there are 100 ways to liberation, and then each of us enforces that there's only one path. And I think digging that out from ourselves and the somatic work that takes is going to be one of the challenges for our institutions in this moment.
Thank you, Carla. And yes, no one being the acceptable trade-off. That's definitely a different way of thinking. So before I jump into some other questions, folks, if you have questions, please use the Q&A function. We'll have a little bit of time at the end for that, just so that folks are aware. So one thing I'm struck by in all of your responses is sort of the different things that are in the way, whether it's the need for multiple tools instead of relying on one, the zero-sum thinking, the even as you said, Carl, the apartheid economy. I want to dig into what it looks like for folks navigating this climate and today and in the past. So going to you, Angela, what historical lessons can we draw from past social justice movements that successfully navigated dark times to drive change?
Oh, well, Carla was talking about one. I don't know if I'd have put this first if she hadn't leaned into it, but we need organizations. We need organizations. We have been able to get things done when we have organizations that have resources, that can mobilize, that can organize, that can provide accurate data, that can get the word out, that know how to use technology. We need organizations. And as you think about it, as Carla pointed out, we are coming out of a period in which we were destroying our own organizations. And so that is terrible right now, that many of the organizations that we have seen propel us forward in terms of the use of technology, in terms of organizing around important issues, have been imploding over the course of the past half decade. So one of the things that we have learned is that our organizations are essential. We should cherish them. And we need to find constructive ways to make them stronger, not destructive. I think people who were engaged in a lot of the destruction were only trying to make the organization stronger, but the way that they went about it was not healthy. And we are caught without what we need at the very moment that we need it. But the other thing that we have learned from the past, particularly from the civil rights movement, is you got to move everything at once. You got to be in the courts, you got to be in the streets, you got to be in the neighborhood associations, in the churches, in the social aspects of life. You got to be able to be in mutual aid. That I watched this thing about John Lewis recently on PBS television, and it reminded us of the bus boycott. And the bus boycott was able to happen for all those, that I think it was over a year, because of the mutual aid. People knew where to get a ride. They knew what the safe streets were to walk to work. mutual aid, all of those things were important for the civil rights movement, and we must not forget that. We can't lift up one thing as being so important and then underfund, underinvest, appreciate the other elements. But the main thing that we have learned when we are successful is the power of transformative solidarity. And I say transformative solidarity to distinguish it from transactional. We can't just be about, you sign my petition, I show up at your rally. It can't even just be about, I'm gonna be an ally in your movement. It's our movement. That your freedom is my freedom. Your injustice is injustice to me. And therefore we have to embrace it all and be in transformative solidarity, which means we have to have moral underpinnings, which means that we have to not denigrate each other or each other's issues. We have to lift them up. We have to be ready when the time comes to show up with everything. And I always say that the civil rights movement, if it didn't teach us anything else, it taught us how to be brave. And it taught us what it means to be brave. What it means to be brave. That's what we need to be brave.
I appreciate that. So how can organizations then balance the need for, this long-term focus on change and committing to it for the long haul, and even individuals and communities with also the need for immediate relief, right? There are things that are right in front of us right now that we need to address while trying to think about the long game. And so again, this is for the broader panel. How do we balance those things? What does that look like?
So I just over the holidays finished reading the new biography on Dr. King, King a Life by Jonathan Aig. And there's this part in it that I just keep telling everyone about where Ella Baker goes to Dr. King and is like, you've been out there in front of the cameras for a really long time. It would be really great if you came internal to our organization and made, because we're a mess. And I was like, oh my God, this has been happening forever. I was like, I'm witnessing Ella Baker say the same thing to Dr. King that I have witnessed so many people say to CEOs. And it just gave me a really good laugh. But I think to that end, part of what I think we need to grapple with is one, this is going to be a time of sacrifice. And we don't like talking about that. We do not like talking about prioritization or sacrifice in progressive institution because we are like, we've got to take care of it all. And I think one piece is we each have to find our lane and stick to the lane, right? Like there are a lot of institutions out there trying to do a lot of work. And there are times in which we trip over each other doing the same kind of work, not because it's not necessary. Yes, we need more people doing all of this all the time. We're not in competition around this, we're in collaboration. But also there are places where we enter things as novices where there are already experts. And I will say that one big inspiration for me has been not being like the tech oligarchs of the moment. And part of even the disruption that Angela was talking about in the last 5 years is that most people are learning the rules of power through the architecture of the internet. And the internet was built by young white men in their late 20s and early 30s who had never known harm a day in their lives. So they did not architect any knowledge about power and harm into their systems. And their number one tool was disruption. And it was disruption so that they could evade labor laws, so that they could evade civil rights laws, so that they could evade regulations. And it worked for them. And I would say that disruption is an important tool, but it cannot be the only tool that we use. In particular, when we're talking about internally, it's one that is built for destruction, not creation. And we need a lot of creation right now, just a lot of creation. So that being said, I think that the other place in which they have inspired me is they will sell you a line of gas around oh, there's no sacrifice here, right? Like, oh, well, democracy is being sacrificed for your platforms. There's no evidence that democracy is being sacrificed. And we have been the acceptable trade-off to them gaining wealth. And because of that, I think we have to be very conscious of the trade-offs that we are going to be making and the sacrifices that we are going to be making, and mourn and grieve those sacrifices together so that we are able to move forward from a place of health. And for so long, I think the way that our country has operated around trade-offs and sacrifices is like, here's this shiny object, usually it's racism or misogyny. That's actually what's happening. Don't worry about this sacrifice. It doesn't matter being made down here. And we are going to have to be like, actually, this sacrifice matters and yet is still necessary. And start to carry an emotional discipline around how we prioritize. Because I think a lot of us, are really trying very hard to hold on to the world as we know it and not as it's becoming.
Thank you, Carla. It sounds like throughout the conversation so far, there's been a really great emphasis on solidarity, organizations working together, working across difference. This is super important. What does that actually look like? So looking at organizations, for example, what does it look like for, or how can nonprofits, philanthropy, intermediaries, advocates work together? What commitments do we need to make?
Yeah, and I'll just say I continue to get so many gems from Angela and Carla in this conversation, and I think are instructive even for this question. But I think, I mean, one of the initial things is we actually have to recognize that we have a lot of collective power. There, we when we think about like just the sheer numbers, but also all of the things that we are doing as individual organizations, and then when you put all that together, that is powerful. And so often we don't lean into that power as institutions. We focus on, our narrow lane. We're afraid to engage in advocacy, to upset anyone. And we really have to shift our thinking there. So I think it's just recognizing that. And, I want to recognize in saying that, we're not set up to do so. We work in silos, our infrastructures leave us exhausted. We're more narrowly focused on a single issue and not the interconnections about how a variety of issues impact communities. Or we're trying to showcase what we do individually so, we can compete for the resources that we desperately need. And those are legacy governance structures we've inherited from not being a fully multiracial democracy and from operating in, an apartheid economy and caste system, those things that Angela and Carla already talked about. So I think there's also a need for us to be in a space of even if, right? Because all those things are still true about organizations right now. And it will continue to take time. It's a longer journey for us to unwind those things and lean into new governance structures and lean into the full promise of who and what we can be. And we also don't have time to do that, right? Because the moment is now. The urgency is right now. And so I think it's imperative for us to just, I think, tap into our own mental models around the power that we have, affirming that, naming that, saying that in conversation with one another, so that we are better able to come together, to come to the table and be able to coordinate offensive and defensive strategies that are needed in this moment and beyond. I think many of us also, we're not all organizers. We're not all coalition builders, right? And those are specific roles. But I do think we all need to be versed and understand the practices that are underneath those, because those are the tools and skills we need to be able to work together effectively. It's not easy work, especially when we think about the conflict that arises and what Carla walked us through already, right? But we have to be committed even if and even when those challenges arise, that we are still in partnership together because we are committed to something greater than any of our individual institutions. I think the other thing that is really important is together, we actually need to reset the broader narratives, that are out there. We know throughout our history, in this moment, tomorrow, next week, conservative forces have and will continue to be very effective with co-opting language, turning that language against us, spinning their own narratives and pushing, racial justice advocates, other advocates into defense mode, with distracting debates, right? Like I think the main ones we see and experience today are around DEI and merit, and these continue to obscure the actual problems of white supremacy and racial capitalism. And, they continue to place us squarely on the stage of authoritarianism. And so I think we really collectively need to grapple with the narratives and have that bravery and be more bold about telling the truth and being clear and intentional with our language. I'll give an example. One thing that I've been thinking of, we've been having all these conversations about DEI and why it's needed and the merits. Why aren't we talking about Jim Crow? Right? Like we have DEI, as a legacy of the affirmative action that came because the civil rights laws weren't enough. And that came as a result of Jim Crow and segregation and all these other things that we know have existed in our history. And so how can we be more explicit about what is happening, and the narrative we need and the counter narrative we need collectively to resist and to build better institutions that are able to withstand these forces?
I just wanted to underscore something that Jennifer said, and that is what we have. Because we have more than we have ever had. We have more than our ancestors going back to before the civil rights movement, but our ancestors from the civil rights movement could have even imagined. We have so many people of color and women who are CEOs of foundations. I used to work at the Rockefeller Foundation in 1995, and I was the senior vice president. There was only one Black president of a foundation and only one other Black person who was two other Black people who were vice presidents of major foundations. I can't count them now. We have people who were CEOs of corporations. We have community-based organizations providing direct services led by people of color who were totally committed to delivering those services with budgets in the hundreds of millions of dollars. We have advocacy organizations that are headed by people who are absolutely committed to everything that we're talking about. We have more than we have ever had. And what are we going to do with it in this moment, which we have been doing all of it to make sure it never came? And if it came, then it would be brief. And it would just be a blip in the story of how do we fully become a fully inclusive, thriving society. To underscore that, because I don't think that we talk about that enough, how much we have. But the question is, what are we going to do with it? How are we going to find each other? How are we going to develop the strategies? But those issues are not hard when you start off with these kind of resources. 60 years ago, people were trying to figure that out. And the first thing they had to figure out was how to get the resources. We have them. Now, how are we going to use them? The other thing I want to emphasize about how all of this together is something that Carla said about really understanding what you bring. what are the assets that you bring, and how do we respect the organizations have those assets and create circumstances in which they can lean into them and be part of the whole.
Thank you for that, Angela. And I think that there's been a lot of interest not only in what we have, but also how we can use it and how do we stay committed. So before I open it up to questions, and there are quite a few questions coming in, I want to dig into a little bit for each of you to talk about how we maintain momentum. How do we come together in solidarity? What does that actually look like? And how do we maintain hope? So each of you can just give us a bit of your insight there.
Well, I'm happy to jump in because I have a podcast on this. It's called Reimagining Democracy for a Good Life. And it really is about how we dig in. It tells the story of Los Angeles, going back to the rebellion in 1965, when LA burned. And LA burned in a way that really brought about racial consciousness and leaning into racial pride and lifting that up. And so we began to have a lot of that kind of activity in Los Angeles. But then in 1992, when the rebellion around the Rodney King decision happened, the groups that had existed, sort of working within their own communities, realized they had to come together, that they had missed this. And so we began to see this multiracial organizing begin to happen. And the multiracial organizing actually turned into very direct policy and advocacy in which groups came together across difference to say, we're going to have community benefits so that if you get the Staples Center or the airport, we're going to make sure that everybody benefits. And it was able to connect with the new labor movement that had started in LA, which is a labor movement around service, around hotel workers, around janitors. People began to bring the new labor into organized labor. And these are the same people who lived in the communities that were doing the multiracial organizing. And that brought around a coalition that was able to put Karen Bass in office, accountable to the people of Los Angeles, focusing on the issues that were there. I tell that story because that is what actually brings about hope. Being able to not just sit around and wish for something to be different, but to use every opportunity to be able to say, how do we make it different? Hope is not wishing. Mary McCullough uses this phrase all the time. Hope is a discipline. And that discipline requires knowing the facts, knowing the history, getting the data, finding out what works, but then finding other people who are investing in what works and coming together to collectively invest in our collective future. I think that we know what to do, and we just need to do it.
The only thing I would add to what Angela just said is that it is the site of doing it is actually where all of the relational ties come together for multiracial democracy, right? When we are able to create generative, like beautiful experiences where people can come together across race and advocate for their rights and be treated well at every level of knowledge about movement that they are in, I really think that folks are going to look at the brutality of the segregation side and be like, yeah, I'm out. Like, that's not what I want. Right. But it takes us really thinking about and being and infusing love into the power that we are moving. Right. Like, I think Bell Hooks did such a great job of talking about the infusion of love into power and how we've stripped those concepts of each other. And I just think that we often look at that as cheesy. And what we have to really remember is that most people are not clued into everything that is happening. And having incredible experiences of each other as we fight for rights is like a fundamental experience to creating what we want in terms of bandwidth, because whatever is happening right now is going to come with an implosion, and it's going to hurt a lot of people. And at that point, people will be very willing to try a lot of new. And that new cannot be built like the New Deal was on the exclusion of people of color. It's got to be built in the way that Angela is talking about, all of us coming together and the least of these being important. But that starts with how we show up for each other.
Yeah, and for me, I would say what's really giving me hope is the power of the small wins. Every movement we look at, it's one thing to look at it in hindsight and see, what we may think of as the culmination or the major winner victory. But when you unpack it, you see that it was a number of everyday people taking steps, exhibiting bravery and courage. And, maybe their names are not the ones that are lifted up, but that's certainly, they are part of the tapestry, the groundswell that led to, the progress that we have known in this lifetime. And so I think about the small wins also because it pulls me out of that feeling of despair. I've seen a lot of people on social media talking about how terrible January was, and it felt like it was 67 days long, or, just because there was an onslaught and a flooding of just bad, terrible news, right? And so I think about the small win, whether it's those lawsuits that I mentioned at the top of our conversation, and judges that are actually holding the line in a time where I wasn't sure that would be the case. Whether it's a church that has the trademark rights, to a name, a moniker that has, brought terror, and now they get to profit from that. I think about past movements, the civil rights movement. Georgia Gilmore, who through the meals that she cooked raised money that supported, these organizations to do that work, right? So I think about everyday people doing their part, having courage to say and to do what we are morally obligated to do in this time and beyond.
I was looking at the questions, and a number of them wanted more specificity about how do you do it. Part of the how you do it is to be clear about what it is that we're trying to accomplish. If we're trying to accomplish transformative solidarity, then we need to make sure that whatever we're doing, we try to pull in the stories, not just our stories. Not, if I'm going to talk about something, I'm not just going to talk about the data that shows how Black people are suffering. I want to show what's happening to women, what's happening to people who are immigrants, what's happening to people who are Latinx and Asian. Be able to pull in all the data so that we paint a bigger picture, and people see me as a Black person being just as concerned about what's happening to people who are not Black, but who are also suffering, and to do that consistently. One of the ways that we do it is we consistently talk like we mean it, that this is not just about me, this is about us, and we collectively have to be concerned about it. The other thing we need to do is really get our interrelated, interconnected interests. These are economic battles. What is happening is for economic gain for a few. The reason that we are suffering so much right now is that we have not been able to translate the social onslaught into economic exploitation. We need to have an economic analysis, and that takes us into being with other people. Get that economic analysis as part of your strategy. The other thing that I think is so important is to document what works. I am of the belief that there is no problem that some community, some place isn't doing something about. We need to document it and share it, call those communities out so that we constantly are reinforcing that we are not alone, We are not alone in the suffering, but we are also not alone in the problem solving, and we will not be alone as we lean forward to be able to make sure that what works is what we're leaning with. Those are some of the things that work, and they're all around us as examples.
One of the things I do a lot when I'm talking to organizations is getting them clear on what power is. And part of what I've been teaching folks is like power is the ability to change my life and other people's lives as a result of access to money, information, community, an audience, decision makers, and decision-making rights. And up until before the internet, part of what happened is we got access to these things a little bit at a time as a result of an institution. And now the internet makes it so you could get one of these things, but not all of these things, right? Like I can do search and subscription and look at medical journals. I don't have to go to medical school in order to do it. I can create community in a lot of niche places. I don't have to depend on my geography to do it. But I think it's important to note that like these 5: money, information, access to decision makers, community, and audience, they are used to impact this one, which is decision-making rights, right? And often we cannot tell when we don't have decision-making rights on something. But I think it's important to see that the billionaires have started to take up all of the rights in the first 5, right? They are usurping a lot of power right now. It's not just money, it's power that they are usurping. And I think personally that we have to fight for rights in each of those categories. And when we do, and we are like, this is what I want, and we're very clear, it's a lot easier to get to coalition when you have a clear ask that you are fighting for. There's like, sometimes we do this thing where like, hey, we should talk about what we're fighting for and maybe work together. And that's all fine and good. But I think when we have a direct ask for rights that we are doing, people end up joining the fight from all over. And that ends up creating coalition. But when we are not clear about what kind of power we're fighting over, that's when you see a lot of the BS backbiting that ends up happening around these issues.
Yeah, and now I know we only have a couple minutes left, so I'll just briefly say I think some of the other components of that too are talking to people, talking to one another, setting up those phone calls, joining each other's conversations, and then also making sure that our organizations are not being gatekeepers, right? How do we make sure we're continuing to share resources, information? Oh, you're doing that? Let me connect you with this organization over here that I know is doing this too, maybe in another geography, or maybe we just haven't been on each other's radars. Those are the kinds of conversations we need to start having, because it enables us to understand who's already doing what. How can I support? How can I amplify? How can I uplift? And we often don't have those conversations. So I think there's a real need for that. Common Future, for example, we're an intermediary. And so we are regularly trying to think about how we make those connections, how we amplify. And I think it's important for all of our organizations to do, because it allows us to hit multiple levers of the broader ecosystem and be able to share and align on goals.
Thank you all so much. Thank our panelists. Thanks for all the questions. So one thing I'm struck by before we wrap up is how many of the questions were about what can we do? Like, what does this look like? Which is a sign that we are all ready to like roll up our sleeves and get this done. And so first, this webinar will be recorded and we'll do a recap of the insights and lessons shared here. Also, Common Future does have a 12-month systems change coalition and community of practice coming up. And so if you are interested in being with like-minded folks who are on this call, in this webinar, please, please, please feel free to join us. I think we're still currently taking applications. And so you can go to our website and learn more about that. Okay. Thanks, y'all. Thank you so much for joining us, all of you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.